So now we are going to move with our program. So the next presentation, the next talk presentation will be about the given by Dr. Bryan Fancher about the nutrition and nutritional aspects in relation to the genetic breeds or genetic improvements done. Dr. Bryan is the owner of Selamo Group, a group that offers consultancy service for agricultural business-related activities with more than 35 years of experience in broiler breeding genetics, broiler meat production, client technical support, agriculture software development, and animal nutrition. Dr. Bryan was the Vice President of Global Technical Operation in Aviation and was responsible for strategic development and the management of Aviation Global Technical Operation, including Global Technical Nutritional Service, Veterinary Service, Technical Transfer, Technical Systems, and the Global Incubation Service. So, welcome, Dr. Bryan. And yeah, can you start? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? First of all, I want to say a big thank you to the RTOC organization for your kind invitation and the hospitality. Special thanks to Dr. Seta, Dr. Dar, Shiara, so many people who have been so helpful in organizing this event and had a lot of interaction with them, thinking about the subject matter for this presentation and travel planning and so forth. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. I've been blessed to work the last 36 years in this global poultry industry, which is absolutely remarkable in the amount of progress that it's achieved in providing economical protein for the planet. We really have a great success story, and I don't think we all often talk about it enough. So today, I want to share with you some astounding information about the progress in broiler genetics, and based on data, not just opinion. What does the data say? And given the fact that I've spent much of my career working in the primary broiler genetics business and working in the broiler integrated production business, I will also like to share with you some of my experiences along the way. It's been a very interesting journey, to say the least. So we're going to be talking today about change in the broiler and how that's affecting our decision making and how we manage the feeding of these birds and the nutrition. The change is not a new consideration. 2,400 years ago, Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, said, "There is nothing permanent except change. Change is inevitable." The real question is, when change happens, how do we transition and adapt to that change? What do we do in response to that change? So for the agenda today, I'm going to talk about broiler genetic progress based on the industry experience. What is the industry actually experiencing? I'm going to use the United States broiler production industry as a proxy for that, because I have access to a very good data set for many years, which basically represents the bulk of the U.S. broiler production industry, which is processing about 165 million broilers each week for meat. So it's a very large industry, and the data is very meaningful when you extrapolate it from a data set that large. Secondly, for this genetic progress, what are the biological changes in the bird that have occurred over time that allow this kind of progress to happen? And then to talk about some considerations that we have to take if we want to A, exploit this genetic potential, and B, if we want to maximize our margin over feeding costs, or in some cases minimize our losses when the market is It's not just about biology, it's also about economics. And then we'll wrap up with some closing comments. So, what has the industry actually experienced? Forget about what the genetic companies say is going to happen. What has actually happened? If you look at industry data. We have in this graph, on the vertical axis, the days to achieve 2,300 grams body weight. On the horizontal axis, the year of production. Each one of these data points represents almost 8 billion broilers. This is not a research project. This is not a genetic company making predictions or saying what should happen. This is what the industry actually experienced. If you look from 1995 to 2022, it's an incredible success story. What does it tell us? If we look at the regression line, every year we're getting to this body weight of 2,300 grams, 0.6 days sooner. That's remarkable. What about feed efficiency? So we've got on the vertical axis feed conversion to that same body weight of 2,300 grams versus year. If you look at the regression line, every single year improving 2 points of FCR. That is a lot of money that the industry has obtained from these improvements in feed efficiency. And it isn't just about the economics. This is an incredible story about reducing environmental impact from creating more efficient animals. In fact, Aviagen, in conjunction with Newcastle University and Dr. Lanine, developed a life cycle analysis model which considers all the inputs and outputs of the broiler production system to estimate things like the carbon footprint. How much does this FCR that we just talked about actually helping reduce the environmental impact on broiler production? If you run the numbers through the model based on actual genetic improvement in the past and projected out to 2029, that improvement in feed conversion each year at 2 points is basically reducing every year the carbon footprint by 1%. Again, a tremendous success story in reducing the CO2 equivalents per ton of meat produced. So I think, again, it's a very compelling story that we have to tell in the poultry industry about reducing environmental impact over time. That's less feed, it's less water, it's less housing, it's less days in the field. There are many valuable components of this. What about breast meat yield, which for some countries is a high value target to go after? If you look at deboned breast meat yield as a function of live weight over time, what has the industry experienced? Every year improving about 0.45% of live weight. Again, incredible achievement, huge economic benefit to the industry in producing these different carcass components. What about some health factors like condemnation rate? This is whole bird condemns as determined by U.S. Department of Agriculture, specifications for things like synovitis, cellulitis, tumors, leukosis. If you look at that trend line, it's really a dramatic reduction in whole bird condemns that have been experienced over the year by the industry. It's amazing. Actually, you're less than 0.1% In the genetic business, you have to have animals that live, that have consideration for welfare traits, carcass component yield. It's a big number of attributes that you have to go after as genetic targets. You can't just select for breast meat yield or FCR. You also have to think about things like cardiovascular health, skeletal health, so forth. Mortality, if you look at that as in terms of mortality percent that happens on a daily basis, it's basically very similar over time. It hasn't really gotten worse. It's actually, if you look at this equation, the slope nor the intercept are significant. You basically have no change over time in the daily mortality rate. So we've talked now about some of the live performance, some health, and some yield progress that's happening. What else has happened in these birds over time that's allowing this kind of progress to occur? I'm sure many of you have seen this illustration before. This is from Dr. Martin Sudoff at the University of Alberta, where they've taken an old genotype that was established in 1957. It's called the Athens Canadian Random Breds, maintained at the University of Georgia. And you can see, if you look over time, up to 2005, how much of a weight differential you see at 56 days of age. And there was some previous work, similar work done with this old genotype by Dr. Havenstein at North Carolina State University. The challenge with those studies are twofold, though. A, that data is now over 20 years old, or close to it. And B, they didn't look at weekly weights throughout that 56-day period, so you don't have a lot of growth curve overlap to compare weight to weight, which is very important because this bird is growing at a much faster rate than this bird, so you have to be able to also look at physiological age, weight to weight. And that's something else we'll talk further about in the next few slides. So that data is old, and so while I was working at Avigen, my colleagues and I really wanted to take a much deeper look at how much the bird has changed, even further back than 1957, compared to our modern genotypes. So what is a good proxy for that? Well, if you think about it, enterprises that got into the business of broiler genetics started in the late 1940s. That's been a few years ago. There is actually a genotype available, though, that has been random bred since 1950. It was established in Cornell, and it's still being maintained at the University of Illinois. It's called the New Hampshire by Columbia. And for the nutritionists in the room, one of the gurus of amino acid research was Dr. Dave Baker. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us, but almost all of his amino acid work that he did was conducted with the New Hampshire by Columbia genotype. So we decided to partner with the University of Arkansas to fund a PhD project to take the New Hampshire by Columbia and some modern genotypes that Avigen had, grow them out to 56 days, and look at every week what's happening with these birds in terms of live performance, processing performance, anatomical differences even down to the gut level, physiological differences, as well as some bioassays in terms of like how efficiently do they digest energy, protein, to take a much deeper look instead of just live performance and processing. And for those of you who may not know, what does a New Hampshire chicken look like? What does a Columbia chicken look like? A New Hampshire chicken is a red-feathered bird. It's considered an old heritage genotype. feed that they used was mash, and 92% of the amino acid advice of aviagens at the time. So this is not high density feed. Okay? But all the conditions are the same. So let's take a look at just how different is the modern broiler to the broiler of 1950. These are the growth curves. This is body weight in grams, age in days. Incredible differential. At 1.8 kilogram, the modern broiler is getting there 19 days faster than the broiler of 1950. And if you want to see what these birds look like, in 42 days, these are both males. There's a New Hampshire by Columbia cross, and in that case, the Ross 308, which we have the Ross 308 and the Ross 708 in the study we compared with. Now, when you have those kind of growth curves, you can start to look at some very interesting things like actually, what is the age that they achieve their maximum growth rate, and what is the maximum growth rate? So you can see in the modern broiler, you've not only changed the age when maximum growth rate occurs, in this case, you're going from like 41 days to 35, and you've more than doubled the achieved actual maximum growth rate. Now, if you look at the feed conversion, and again, all of these graphs are going to be the same. The blue line, New Hampshire by Columbia, the red and the purple, the Ross 308, Ross 708. You look at that and you say, well, yeah, the modern broilers are more feed efficient, but it doesn't look super dramatic because you're looking at it as a function of age. Again, as I was alluding to earlier, you really need to think about the physiological age. The growth rate is so different in the modern birds versus the New Hampshire by Columbia that you have to look at everything as a function of weight. And when we do that, the data comes alive. Now you can see feed conversion as a function of the live weight. And what does that tell us? At 1.8 kilo that we were referring to earlier, the modern broiler is 52 points better in FCR. That's a staggering amount of FCR. And it's something for people to think about when you want to go back to these slow growth genotypes. You're going to give up a lot of feed conversion to do that. There could be marketing reasons to do so, but there are biological consequences of doing so. How about breast weight? Again, we're going to look at everything now as a function of live weight. This purple line is the New Hampshire by Columbia. The blue line, 308. The orange line, 708. What do we see? At 1.8 kilo, the modern broiler has 77% more breast meat at the same weight. That's incredible. What about the liver? Because again, we want to understand how these birds are actually achieving so much genetic progress. When we look at it as a function of weight, and we look at the same body weight of 1.8 kilo, we see that the modern broiler has 18% more liver to the same weight. Okay? What about the pancreas? Pancreas weight, body weight. At the same 1.8 kilo of body weight, the modern broiler has 15% more pancreas. What about the small intestine? This is the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, collectively the weight. Again, the weight of the small intestine versus body weight. At 1.8 kilo, the modern broiler's small intestine is 25% heavier. And it isn't just the total weight. centimeter is heavier. So it's a more dense structure to the gut mucosa. Let's look at the small intestine length. To the same weight of 1.8 kilo, 15% longer small intestine. Now, let's take it down to the villus. This is the villus length. The blue is the 308, orange 708, gray the New Hampshire by Columbia. So the modern birds have longer villus, and if you look at the width, they're wider. So you've got different dimensional characteristics of the villus, and you've got a longer intestinal tract. So if we assume that the small intestine is the shape of the cylinder, we can calculate the surface area. So when we do that, we see very marked differences in the total gut surface area in the small intestine. In fact, on average, the modern broiler has 52% more digestive capacity. It can handle higher feed intakes and digest it very efficiently. Some people would say, okay, but isn't it because the modern broiler digest protein more efficiently or digest energy more efficiently? Well, at 32 days, 27 days, we actually did ileal digestibility bioassays for protein and energy. And when you look at this is 308, 708, New Hampshire by Columbia, let's look first at the protein digestibility, no difference. Energy digestibility in red, no difference. There's not a difference in the efficiency of digesting it. The difference is in the volumetric capacity to consume the feed and digest it very well. That is a big change in the bird. So, the modern broiler has greater total digestive capacity. It's very capable of consuming and digesting more feed than the old genotypes. That allows faster growth rate, higher consumption in a shorter period of time. That in and of itself is a big advantage because you've got reduced age to a given body weight. That means less days in the field. And that pays big dividends because we don't need to spend those extra days getting to the same weight, and feed for maintenance alone is going to cost us a lot. All those days of reduced maintenance, that's a big benefit to feed conversion. And fewer days in the field mean fewer days for something to go wrong. Like we're talking feed outages, power outages, water outages, additional mortality, Coxie challenge. One of my colleagues at ConAgra, when I worked there as a nutritionist in the broiler integration, used to say, nothing good comes from more days in the field. So, the modern broiler is well equipped to consume feed at a much higher level, digest it very efficiently to turn it into protein. Some literature or press out there suggests that, the modern broiler is cardiovascular challenged, it's a skeletal challenge. Well, let's look at what the heart weight actually was in this study. When we look at it, actually, when you get out here again to like 2,000 grams, there is no difference. There's a very slight differential, let's say 1,000 grams, but there is no compelling evidence in the literature that size dictates function of the cardiovascular system. And the mortality in these projects was like very low, less than 2%. Because the reality is, and I can't speak for all breeding companies, I've worked for 2 of them, but I can tell you that the for the last 23 years, every bird that's pedigreed has to go through batteries of tests, including electrocardiograms, MRI, X-ray, oximeter testing. There's a panel of medical testing that is done that's human-grade medical technology, or that bird will not be pedigreed. So my point is, the birds that are selected and pedigreed, they're elite candidates for body weight gain, feed conversion, carcass component yield, and all of these health attributes, or they will never be pedigreed. And that's about 1% of the population that gets pedigreed. So you're picking out the very, very best over and over. And then when you talk about skeletal, at 21, 35, and 49 days, we actually check the tibia raking strength. And when we put that as a function of body weight, you can see that actually the modern broilers, especially beyond 1,000 grams, have a stronger tibia. And that's not a surprise, because for many, many years, a lot of pressure has been placed on skeletal strength in broiler selection. So let's talk a little bit now about how do we exploit this genetic potential? Because we know there's a lot of genetic progress, but how do we make sure we try to exploit as much of that as possible? Particularly when we're trying to maximize our margin over feeding cost. Because it's all a function of the cost of the inputs and the value of the outputs. And what is the delta? Are we making money or losing money? And at the end of the day, what are we growing? Protein. So if we look at, this is the protein mass of the bird. And if you look at the actual carcass composition, and you graph it out, this is a modern genotype, in this case the Ross 308AP and the New Hampshire by Columbia. You see a huge difference at a given age for the amount of protein that you've actually created. And we know, as we've already talked about, that at a given age the modern broiler is able to eat a lot more feed. But we got to remember that when we look at feed intake as a function of body weight, that improvement in FCR means that at a given weight, let's say 1,500 or 2,000 grams, the bird is eating a lot less feed. But we want to produce the same amount of muscle mass. If we do the math, there is no way that we can achieve that without factoring in changing the amino acid density, for example. So again, if we think about over time, say over a 25-year period, and we're getting a 2-point reduction in feed conversion every year, and that's already been demonstrated that that's achievable. We know that coming along with that, feed intake is declining in order to have that reduction in FCR at a given body weight. So, we have to adjust the nutrient density, or we're never going to be able to extract the maximum genetic potential, because their feed intake is going down over time. And let's do a simple exercise to demonstrate that. Let's think about an 1,800 gram broiler. That broiler is about 16.7% protein if you grind up that whole carcass, the feathers, the gut, the legs, the head, everything. About 16.7% protein. Of that, that's going to create 301 grams of protein from an 1,800 gram broiler. That protein is 6.9% lysine. It's the greatest amino acid in proteins. That's 20.7 grams of lysine in an 1,800 gram broiler. Now, if we take that number and look at over time, we divide it by the cumulative feed intake, we calculate then the required average dietary percent of lysine just continue to produce the same amount of protein. And when we do the math, what do we see? Average digestible lysine for the entire feeding period to produce an 1,800 gram broiler, 301 grams of protein, 20.7 grams of lysine. We have to change the dietary percentage of lysine over time to accommodate that reduced feed intake. And that's not the total digestible the lysine requirement. That's just for the growth to produce that animal. We still have to deal with maintenance. We still have to deal with the efficiency of utilization in terms of physiology. But you can clearly see every year we're having to adjust the diet about 0.01% lysine to get that same amount of protein deposition on less feed. And that's why you see companies like Avage, over time their amino acid levels are being increased. You cannot get the full potential if you don't. Of course you can feed less, but you're not going to get the full potential if you feed less, unless you go back to the broiler of the past. Now, that is a theoretical calculation based on the genetic improvement over time. So we look at that same industry data set and we look at how they actually change their diets over time, we will find out if this theory holds water. Because what would you expect? If it's true, over time, the industry should recognize that and increase lysine level, as an example. And because you're improving partly the feed efficiency by fewer days in the field and lower maintenance requirement, you're likely to see dietary energy levels decline. When we look at that same set of industry data I started showing you in the beginning, what do we see? From 2002 to 2022, this is average dietary digestible lysine. What has the industry done? They've taken it up almost 0.01% every year. Because they've learned, you give the input, you get an output. And they get a return on their investment by taking amino acid density up and extracting the genetic potential. And what does dietary energy do on average? Declines. About 3 calories per kilo per year, which is a lot of money to be saved in that area alone. Now, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about the modern broiler that we have today. Just how responsive does it continue to be when we manipulate dietary energy and amino acid density? To do that, you need good, solid research facilities and programs to evaluate this. And for more than 20 years, at Avage, we did a lot and continue to do a lot of research where you take many different levels of amino acids, density, everything linked to lysine and energy, and you run these fractional factorials, or some people call them orthogonal designs, central composite designs, because you want to pick out different combinations from a pretty large area, so that you can then statistically estimate all points in between from a three-dimensional surface. Then we can find what's the optimal under a given set of economic conditions, which are fluid, they're always changing, but you want to be able to do that. And I'll give you an example of experimental results that were done in the last year that show just how responsive this is. This three-dimensional graph, you've got feed conversion on the vertical axis, both sides, adjusted to 2 kilos. BP is balanced protein. That's amino acid density, everything linked to lysine. Everything's at the same ratio to lysine. So you've got 100, would have been Avage advice, down to 80%, up to 130%. Energy, but not nearly as much as the slope of going from 80% amino acid density to 130. It's huge. So the broiler responds to both, but it's much more responsive to amino acid density. And if we just want to optimize the biological performance in terms of FCR, then we would see in this case, it's at about 108% of the ABH and advice of energy and 123% of the amino acid current advice. The broiler would respond to levels higher than are currently being advised. Because again, that's advice you put out on a global basis. It's not for every particular situation. But the point is, if you just want to optimize biology, you would feed even more amino acid density than we currently advise. Now, what about though if we want to look at considering the economics, margin over feed cost to produce a kilogram of eviscerated carcass? Again, we've got margin over feed cost for the carcass going up in profitability versus balanced protein versus energy density. Again, you see there's some responsiveness to energy, but huge responsiveness to amino acid density. And we'll find an optimum for the economics under that particular set of conditions of lower than the biology. 97% of the energy advice, 112% of the amino acid advice. And then if we look at margin over feed cost to produce a kilogram of breast meat, not the whole carcass, very similar picture, very responsive to amino acid density, responsive but not nearly as much to energy, with an optimum that's higher to produce a kilogram of breast meat than a kilogram of whole carcass. So there's a different product mix, a different price point for breast meat versus a whole carcass. My point is, once you understand how the broiler is responding a given genotype to energy and amino acid density, you can apply any given set of economic input costs and output values and find your optimum. Okay, we spent a lot of time talking about amino acids and energy because all nutritionists will know that those are the two big fish to go after in terms of cost of the diet. But I don't want to discount the other nutrients in the diet too. It is very important also to factor in your micronutrients like vitamins and trace minerals. Again, compared to energy and amino acids, it's a lower cost as a percentage of the diet, but it's critical to optimize biological performance and health. And under field conditions, we don't usually see a lot of classic nutritional deficiencies, but marginal shortages cost us in terms of effects on FCR and overall robustness. When you're a nutritionist, it's a multifactorial decision about supplementation levels for these kind of nutrients. And you have to take into consideration a lot of different things. What level of biological performance are you getting? You go to New Zealand, where they're getting a 1.2 FCR on a 2 kilo, their intake is even lower. They got to think about taking concentration up even higher. Bird welfare, proper tissue and bone growth and development. The needs of the various cellular biochemical systems. What chemical form are you using? If we're talking about trace minerals, is it an inorganic? Is it an organic? And if it's inorganic, is it a sulfate? Is it an oxide? You have to factor those things in. And what are the target tissues? Then we have all these operational stressors that we have to account for. Hatching conditions, chick holding conditions. How far are you transporting that bird? When I worked at Aviation, we're putting birds on airplanes and flying them all over the world. There's a lot of stress that these chicks are encountering. Your rearing environment, kind of temperature, humidity effects, level of disease challenge that your flocks are experiencing, cocci challenge. Because we want a good immune response. We We've got to cope with oxidative stress. Stocking density. If we put everybody in this room in 10% of the space and we're all standing like this, your cortisol levels are going to go up. There's more stress involved with that when you crowd people or animals into conditions. So if you have higher stocking densities and reduced feed and water accessibility, that is also another stressor that has to be accounted for. Catching, transporting, holding conditions. Feed manufacturing. Lots of people want to get these premixes so small in size that you're adding, a half a kilo of something into 1,000 kilos of other ingredients in a mixer, and it can be done, but you better be on top of your game with weighment accuracy with those kind of low-level ingredient inclusions. Mixing uniformity. How often are we monitoring the mixer profiles to make sure we're getting uniform dispersion of those nutrients in the mix? Thermal degradation. We were talking yesterday about salmonella control with conditioning. Well, I can tell you, working with two different breeding companies, they are paranoid about thermal processing because they can't afford to have any birds with salmonella. At Aviagen, we're running like 85C for 4 minutes to knock down this microbial challenge in the feed, and you will damage the nutrients, not only micronutrients like some of the vitamins, but amino acids like lysine, because you've got a lot of heat and time and temperature and moisture. And your feed storage conditions, and how long is that feed being held on the farm and farm feed bins. So, not unlike the amino acids, we have to think about modifying inclusion rates for micronutrients as feed conversion improvements continue to come on and birds are eating less per unit of weight, and considering the rearing conditions we're putting these birds under. Dr. Septa was asking me to maybe share some experience in terms of nutritional issues in the field. I've seen a few of those when I was working at ConAgra, for example. As I said earlier, we're processing, I think in those days, about 15 million broilers a week and making about 65,000 tons of feed a week. So sometimes things go wrong. And I will say that most cases, and I know I'm probably biased because I'm a nutritionist too by training, but in most cases the formula is okay. The nutritionists have spent a lot of time thinking carefully about the ingredient inclusion levels, the nutrient restrictions, and so forth. But you got to manufacture that feed according to the formulation too. And at least in my experience, this is not always the case, but in many cases where we had nutritional issues, it could be backtracked to our quality control or feed manufacturing. And this gets into staying on top of your ingredient composition and having strong quality control protocols in place. If your suppliers know you're checking routinely, things always get better. They know that you're checking closely. Ingredient contamination. Okay, you get a truckload of wheat mids, but what was in that truck before it had wheat mids in it? Were they hauling fertilizer? Or what were they hauling? You can get cross-contamination from these transportation vehicles. Ingredient bin issues at the feed mill. I've seen situations where you have like 4 huge metal ingredient bins at the mill for the minor ingredients, your calcium carbonate, your phosphate, salt, things like that. Well, over time, you get abrasion, you get oxidation, and I've seen situations where the phosphate was bleeding into the calcium carbonate bins. So you get all kinds of problems, not because of the formula, not because of the person putting it into the mixer, because you're getting crossover in the bins themselves. Ingredients can't be adding a small amount of phosphate into a major scale. There's too much free fall. You won't be able to add it accurately. Feed mix uniformity. Again, doing good mixer profiles. Mixers are volumetric devices. They have to be checked for the kinds of feed you're making as to how much you can put in there and get a good uniform mix in how much time. Improper calibration of downstream liquid applications like fat, mold inhibitors, enzymes. Those things also have to be very carefully calibrated. Nutrient degradation from thermal processing. That usually isn't a huge issue in most industry clients that I've worked with, but at a primary breeder level, we can lose up to 15% of our lysine with that thermal degradation. If you don't correct that in your formulation, you will pay the price, and you'll have a lot of angry people involved. Finished feed bin issues at the feed mill. People dumping pullet grower feed on top of broiler grower feed by accident. You know, you've got to really stay on top of that. Feed delivery errors, that usually isn't a huge issue, but it can happen. Feed storage conditions and retention time of that feed at the farm. And this is particularly an issue when you deal with like broiler breeders, separate male diets, small quantity. That feed can be sitting in that rooster feed bin for over a month if you're not careful. And hot weather in the summer, you can have a lot of vitamin loss. So, to wrap up, it's amazing in my career to be able to experience and see the magnitude of the improvements. It's been so fun to be a part of that and see that happen. And here's the good news. We have not yet plateaued. It takes 5 years to go from pedigree to the broiler house. The birds of 5 years from now, they're already pedigreed. And these genetic improvements, FCR, yield, they're still coming. So we have not yet plateaued. The modern broiler is well equipped to consume higher feed intakes and digest and utilize that feed very well, convert it into protein. But to exploit this potential, as we've been talking about, we have to change with the bird in terms of the nutrient density that we provide. Good animal husbandry is only going to become more important. Think about this. As you get to a given body weight sooner and sooner and sooner, the first 10 days, the critical brooding period, is becoming a bigger percentage of your total grow out. If something happens the first 10 days, the train has left the station. You won't be able to make it up. So for the moment that chick hits the ground, we have to be on top of our game. Got to have good quality control protocols in place. People know what they're doing, sampling, checking. Makes a huge difference. At the end of the day, we're all trying to make a profit, so we always have to be looking at what's the cost of the inputs versus the value of the outputs, so that we can actually drive decision making according to margin over feed cost. That is a moving target. The price of ingredients today is going to be different a month from now, and the meat prices are going to be different 2 months from now. So it's a moving target we have to routinely monitor. So thank you very much for your time. And thank you for staying awake after lunch for the last speaker. It's always a bit of a you never know.
Thank you, Dr. Bryan, for the nice presentation. Now we can have your questions. Yes, we have a question.
Anyhow, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. It used to be, and it's highly appreciated. so as to improve the hybrid, to make a hybrid or what we call a progress in the future, near future. They said we can't make any more progress in chicken. I don't know whether you read about this or not, but I like your statement of being optimistic in this matter.
That's a great question. I too am optimistic because I've had the luxury of seeing what the birds are doing that are being pedigreed, so I know what they're going to look like for the next 5 years at least. I do believe that eventually it will slow down in terms of the amount of progress, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing because we've made so much improvement in those areas. We can put even more pressure on health attributes, welfare attributes, things like that. But at least for the next 5 years, it has not plateaued. The progress is still coming.
We have noticed, me and you maybe are the same age.
Yeah.
What we were talking about 2 to 1.
Yeah.
As people were there and lower weight, and you can see now not much progress when it comes to weight of people living for it.
Yes.
I'm more optimistic, just like you are.
Yes. You have to be optimistic. Yeah. So yeah, it's most people will not appreciate or know just how much human medical grade imaging technologies are being used to screen these birds, the only pedigree birds that are very, very healthy. And it costs a lot of money, but at the end of the day, it brings a lot of value. And they only get more sophisticated. And now, since 2016, genomics is having a big, not cloning or gene insertion, but genomics is allowing them to be much more accurate in their predictions on improvements and heritabilities, especially for breeders, for things like hatchability and fertility, which are not huge heritability values. So the technology is getting better and better and better.
Thank you very much. Nice presentation. I have a question for the boss, about the recommendation. I found these 2 recommendations regarding the digestible lysine. One of the plant-based and the other animal protein-based diet. Why they got 2 different digestible, and at the end we have formulated the diet on digestible amino acid and digestible lysine.
Right. Those plant-based protein diets were developed primarily for the European market, where they were even earlier than a lot of countries going to antibiotic-free. So they're trying to reduce the nitrogen content of the diet because of concerns about foot pad dermatitis, litter conditions, ammonia. Most of the world refers to the other advice, but there are some companies that like to utilize that plant protein-based advice, which is lower amino acid density, but that's the minority of the world. It's not the majority.
So it's the welfare more than the nutrition.
Yeah. Yeah, especially if you're being scrutinized very carefully on hot burn, foot pad dermatitis, those kind of things. But now that we have more and more synthetic amino acids available, the total dietary protein is becoming lesser of an issue because we really